Welcome to Listening to Silence, a video podcast in which I interview two guests per episode, discussing with them meaningful, productive, and reflective ways in which they use silence in their work and life. My guests are activists, artists, educators, curators, and other cultural practitioners usually working within the field of decolonial memory practice. Welcome to another episode of Listening to Silence, the video podcast series where I interview artists, activists, usually doing decolonial work with a colonial background or post-colonial background, and somehow deploying or using silence in their work actively. And today I have with me Yan and Shadman.
Hi.
Visual artist and researcher, a photographer and a researcher. And I'm really interested in hearing more about the different ways in which you guys use silence in your work. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
I guess the first question is always the same. You introduce yourself a little bit more, and if you can work already directly towards your personal relationship with silence.
Mm-hmm.
You want to go first?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Yanxian Zhao. I'm a Chinese Cantonese visual artist based in the Netherlands. On top of that, I'm also doing a lot of side business such as calligraphy, lecturing, and tea. So, yeah. Chinese is a high-end tea. And that's every artist does. Yeah, have a major job called artist and then have so many side business to sustain it themselves.
Fair.
Yeah.
And how about your relationship to silence? If you have some first thoughts about it.
Yeah, my silence. I think I grew up in the silence. I grew up in a small village in Taishan, which is the birthplace of the Chinese labor. And then I grew up also not in our own house. It was a house from these female immigrants who left the country years ago. And then in our dining room, daily basis, there's family albums, a series of family albums hanging in the living room and constantly staring at me very silently. And as I grew older, I always asked people, who are they? Like, why are they here in our living room? Of course, they were there because it's not our house, it's theirs, but they don't present anymore. But nobody knows what's their story, how they left, how they living anymore after they left. And then I grew up in this silence of women, especially immigrant women. And then I always want to know, I always want to break their silence and come to know them. Yeah.
So interesting first introduction to silence, this silence of certain forms of oppression, the silence of women, let's say, a type of silence you want to break. And then the silence of these photographs of people that you didn't know kind of staring at you, which is also perhaps the silence you want to break, but it's also a silence that speaks to you somehow or has a certain magnetic kind of power over you.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shadman, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Shadman Shahid. I'm a photographer and an educator and a researcher. And I come from Bangladesh, which is in South Asia. And I've been living here for 7 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And my personal relationship to silence is that of necessity, I think. I'm a deeply introverted person, as you know. But at the same time, it is somehow a privilege because I grew up in a house with the entire family, so the extended family, with my uncles, my cousins, my aunts, my father, mother, grandmother. And sometimes the whole village would come and stay with us in our house, literally. So silence was always sort of a privilege. And I really cherish the moments that are silent for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So that's already kind of a quite different, I think, personal relationship to silence, to the extent that the way you describe silence is as a privilege, as something that you don't always have access to. Once you do have access to it, it comes kind of as a relief or as something pleasurable or even necessary, like you said,
It is, yeah.
for mental health probably and for feeling safe and secure. Yeah, very good. And then speaking of silence and elephants in the room, there's one thing that we haven't discussed yet, which is the fact that you guys are a couple.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I'm not shocking anyone. I think we talked about this before, and if I was okay to say this.
Yeah, of
of course.
So this is a unique situation on the podcast. This hasn't happened before. I've had guests before who are friends or who have worked together before. I mean, you and I have worked together before. We used to be colleagues at the Art Academy in The Hague.
Yeah.
But to have a couple over, that's new for me as well. So the question that I don't usually get to ask is about silence is, as a couple, let's say, what is your joint relationship to silence, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question to think about for me as well, because it's kind of implicitly always there, but you don't think about it explicitly. This role of silence in love, basically, and care. I think for me, Yen is probably the person I've spent most of my silent moments with. And as I've mentioned before, it's really, really precious for me that I can do that with someone and I can feel safe and be myself around that person. So silence is like a sort of a womb, very warm and safe, and it feels nice to be there with Yen, at least for me. Yeah.
That's really nice. Do you feel the same way?
I'm a very talkative person in a relationship. For me, in my culture, women are always taught to be silent. And then, so when I'm in a relationship and it's comfortable, I tend to talk so much.
Right.
So I only use silence when I'm trying to avoid conflict. Yeah.
So you use silence actively as a way to avoid conflict.
Yeah.
Which is, and then the way you're framing it, that sounds like it's not a good thing, or is that sometimes a good thing as well?
Yeah, it's a good thing. So like I am very easy to get hot-headed. So it's nice to use silence as a moment to cool myself down and go back to rationality.
Right.
Yeah.
So silence as a form of kind of reflection or a pause.
Yeah.
But not as a weapon, let's say, because the silent
No.
treatment is also a form of using silence in conflict, for example.
No, it's a way to get myself out of a lot of emotions and then can think rationally.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Like, I mean, and probably for you, when you say that it's the relationship is also kind of a safe space of silence, with you being an introverted person, it also probably means that you can feel safe enough to be silent around your partner.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
And
you understand what it means to be an introvert. That's
Well.
that's nice. That's not always the case. It doesn't mean that I don't speak. I usually can just go to a room and start speaking to everyone. But that's not my natural mode of being. So I think with Yen, it feels indeed more natural to be myself. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I know what you mean. I'm not sure if I am an introvert, but there's a side of me that is, I think, and I can also go into places and speak a lot, but then eventually I have to retreat, and preferably with someone who accepts that and kind of loves you for it, of course. Yeah. And then final question, you also have a child together who is 2.5 years old.
Yeah.
So is there a lot of silence right now?
No.
No. There's the opposite of silence, but which is nice. He's in that age where like every sound he makes is like makes us joyful. So he's very cute and sweet, and he's learning how to manipulate us and saying why he doesn't want to go to school, and like the sounds that come with it is quite nice. But to be honest, there is one moment in the day I spend with him, like an hour or so, where we go in front of there's like a small river flowing in front of our house, and we just stand there and stay quiet, and he calls it calm. Like that's our calm. So that's also nice, I think. What we do.
That is really beautiful. And also kind of an interesting kind of thought to keep in mind that children also need silence, even from their parents from time to time.
Yeah.
They need a lot of talking. and instructions, but they also need to be able to feel safe with you in silence and calmity, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. He's not very silent with me.
No?
No, he's always talking, bugging, and
Demanding.
demanding. Yes, unless he's asleep, then I will have a moment of silence. But once he's awake, my life is very busy and chaos.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
And you like that?
not all the time, but sometimes it
Yeah.
can be very exhausting. But it's sweet. Yeah.
All right. Well, good. It's nice to have you both. It's nice to see kind of the personal kind of angle to this. We'll see if we can bring it back in from time to time when we start talking about your professional practice, let's say, and the role silence plays in it. So I think this is a good bridge to get there. Let's talk about your work as researchers, as artists. My first question is always, and preferably use concrete examples of your work. What do you do, and how does silence play a role in it?
I'm currently working on a project about Chinese woman diaspora history. And as I mentioned in my relationship with silence, this woman's experience was largely ignored in the past. When we talk about diaspora immigration history, it's often marked by the men's trace, like when did it start and how did it start, what are the conflicts, what are the challenges, etc. And what women are kind of like largely invisible in the past, and but however they also influence a lot in this Alienation Act, also in the colonial history, and they were just not talked about. And as a childhood inspiration, I often curious what do they want, and the older I got, the more whisper I heard from this woman being silenced. And for example, some of the women who often marry to a immigrant man, however they probably never met or just firstly met, and then they go into marry, and then the woman have to migrate into a new country that they barely speak the language, and their legal dependency on the man, economy dependency, even like a network, right? So it's kind of a strange situation. You marry to a strange man in a country where you have no family member, not knowing anything. And then some of the women are very vulnerable to domestic violence. However, they also not allowed to leave because they have nowhere to live, nowhere to ask for help. But also there were also women who left behind in the country, and then endure years of like a war, famine, and etc. And then they go finally, after the Alienation Act from the host country ended, they went into the husband's country. Sometimes for 50 years, they never see their husband. And then nobody talk about their contribution in that time, and then they just assume them happy forever again.
Right.
So I'm doing this project, and I'm just to focus on the woman's experience in the migration and really shine light in their resilience and contribution in the whole process.
Yeah. So that's very good. So this is a project about, let's say, silenced histories, silenced identities, silenced memories, in a patriarchal situation where the woman's voice doesn't count. So it's a story. It's a project about women's silenced histories.
Yeah.
And you're figuring out ways to get them to speak up about the things that they were quiet about before.
Yeah.
Do you think it is the case that these women didn't talk about their histories at all, or did they talk maybe among each other, for example, and it's just also a question of within the patriarchal context that people don't listen to these stories?
I think it's both. First of all, the women's activity are often very domestic in terms of immigrations. They are harder to integrate with the society. They are harder to get a job, and they are required to contribute a lot to the care that only happen in the family. So So most of women, after they migrate, it takes years to have a friends in the society they were living in, and then to get their voice out, you have to have a connection to the outside world, and you can speak to the outside world, right?
Yeah.
So then that's why their stories are often happen in the domestic environment, but also in the Chinese context, especially the region I'm from, because a lot of Chinese migrant men, they would come back to the region they were from to marry a woman. So they kind of sort of need to maintain a narrative that for women, the only happiness and the only way to migrate abroad is to marry a man. And the woman's independent narrative kind of like not taught much in the society, but also the suffering of the woman after the marriage also not mentioned about in the public.
Yeah.
So it's both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's both a question of not having a community that would hear these stories or that would have the possibility of kind of like sharing these kinds of experiences.
Yeah.
But then it's also that there are certain taboo topics.
Yeah, and also it's about the shame and guilt structure that built over years under the patriarchal society. And for women, it's hard to talk about these family issues because it considered as a shame, and you're not allowed to talk to others.
Yeah.
And then it caused a lot of self-silencing also.
Self-silencing, exactly.
Yeah.
So the silencing comes from both sides, let's say, because of course self-silencing it's also already a reaction to an oppressive context.
Yeah, and also is like the self-silencing is also matters to self-survival.
Yeah.
Imagine if you are the woman in that situation, and if you speak up, it comes a lot of consequence, right? What if that you come into a divorce, and where are they going? They go back to their home country, or like if they have kids, right? And then, or the violence, if they speak it up, maybe the violence can escalate in the future.
Yeah.
So then it's a lot of matters comes to this self-silencing
Yeah, I understand.
result. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's often the case when we discuss silences in this podcast. That silence also has an ambiguous kind of dimension, or that or double kind of to the extent that on the one hand, the self-silencing is a symptom of an oppressive kind of context. On the other hand, you can also describe it indeed as a form of self-protection, protection from escalation of violence, protection for your loved ones, your children, for example.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make it good, but there is still there's a protective side to it, and the opposite of that. So that is interesting. I'm sorry, Shadman. I'll get to you in a second.
Not at all. This is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. Because one more question I have for you before continuing with you, Shadman, is so how do you do this? You have these stories. You want to get them to speak about things that they haven't spoken about before. How do you start these conversations?
And now my project, my research is still on the very beginning phase. Of course, I understand it's very hard for women to talk about this sort of experience. And probably I wasn't even intent for them to speak up. So I just make a safe place. I open workshops, and then I ask people, like no matter man or woman, to bring a photo of their female family members. And because their care often happen in the domestic environment, so the offsprings or the close ones, they are the one to prove their contribution or to know the best of their resilience in the past. They bring their family album to the workshop, and then they will use one of the techniques, the maternal techniques from the woman in the family, and start making art to recreate photos. Of course, I will guide them, for example, like how was their experience in the diaspora and what do you think their contribution it is. They can choose to speak up as long as they feel safe. If they don't, they can just make their art. Like the art itself is to portray them in a way that we think is right. So sometimes it can say it out with words. Sometimes it can say it out with working, with art, with visual presentations. Yeah,
I like that a lot. So because that was going to be my question. The thing is, when it comes to silenced histories, I also know this from my own work and research. Breaking silences, that's what we often hear in the West. We have to break the silence. And it can be a very violent way of kind of expressing what we really want to do is to kind of for people to feel safe enough to talk. And breaking silence is a metaphor that doesn't really fit with that intention often, depending on whose silence we're talking about. So what I like about the way in which you describe it is that you listen to their silence and you kind of decide, depending on how it goes, whether or not they want to talk, or maybe they want to express their memories and feelings differently.
Yeah.
Perhaps not in language, perhaps in the work that they make or the art that they are producing.
Yeah, and also breaking the silence is not important, not so much important for me to speak out to the outside world, but
Right.
more important for me is the personal perception of their ancestors or themselves, that to give them an idea to say, okay, what happened in the past is not just what I think it was. It has another light. It has another side of it, and then the idea of care or contributions, it can be various, and we should get into consideration as well. So for me, the work most important is not to tell the world, okay, the women have done so much, but is to plant a seed inside to say, okay, that is your autonomy, that's your agency, and then you can develop from there. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a way to kind of help people get control over their own story, their own narrative, let's say, but it can still be in the private sphere. It doesn't have to be a story that is broken out into a kind of a wider audience always, per se.
Yeah, like whoever feels like, then they can be in the public, but there's so many people doesn't want to be in the public, but they still need that blinking of silence moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a selective silence that is empowering within particular spheres, and it kind of works because of the fact that it's selective. Not everybody has to hear these stories immediately, as long as people can hear them for themselves to begin with.
Yeah.
It's really inspiring. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a really good flowing bridge from this to your work, but I guess the same question applies. Like, what do you do? What are you working on? And if you can, what role does silence play in it?
Yeah, maybe I can build a bridge. I think
nice.
we both work with archival material, specifically photographic archives. In my practice before, I've also worked with family archives and worked with silences in domestic settings. So looking at Miriam Hirsch's theory, which Ian very kindly gave to me, was how family albums can be very biased in how they portray the familial history. And I was trying to see what a fuller history might look like and what an alternative family album can look like. That was in the past, and the work was called No Quarter. And it was also about domestic violence from the perspective of a woman, one of my family members who had been in a violent relationship for 30 years or so. So I took interviews of her and recreated the family album together with her. But now I'm looking at colonial archives, specifically British colonial archives of Bengal, the region I come from. And perhaps looking at photography as a tool for silencing, actually. Because, as you know, when photography was invented, it came around the same time when history was invented, or sort of our understanding of recording knowledge was being shaped in a new way. Modern, like birth of modernism, maybe. I'm not sure. You're more of an expert in that. Like close to that era, right?
Sure. And you mean the kind of photography as a tool to kind of record the official version of the truth?
Indeed. And it was immediately used as a tool for imperial and colonial purposes, right? So right after it was invented, the camera was sent to Calcutta, Bengal, my region. And one of the first things the British did with the camera was to photograph the people that lived there. I don't want to get into the whole history. There's a history of uprising, and there was a change in regime in the British colonial system from the East India Company to the British Raj. And it was mostly led by Bengali people. And the camera was immediately used to document every kind of person there is, right? And they were also making history at that time, making archives, documenting things, leaving things out. And in the process, they were silencing the locals. So the photograph then becomes a kind of forced representative of the local people, and the photograph spoke on behalf of the local people. And in the process, the local voice was silenced. And now I'm looking at how these voices can be included in our understanding of history and knowledge. And so I'm looking at the process of unarchiving, so like doing in archives.
Unarchiving as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
What does that mean?
unarchiving means to, well, let's say, how do I explain this best? I think there's a Bengali word called mon. Can mean many things amongst memory, right? And to remember means to remember means mone kora. So in Bengali, it's mone kora, which if I translate very literally, it means to do in memory. So unarchiving is sort of like that. I want to do in the archives. So I work with archives. I take archival images right now, more specifically from the internet, because again, I don't want to get into too much into theory, but this idea of the wild archive, archival photographs or documents that have kind of escaped the regime of the natural archives. And I'm trying to see what they have to say now that they're free, in a way. So I'm looking at gazing as an act of defiance against the colonial gaze. So both, I think the colonial gaze is silently always present, and the act of gazing is also to be silent and to receive.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'm trying to see how gazing, an act that is a silent act, can be a way to defy the silencing of local voices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting. So I think in a way, if I can retrace quickly to the previous project that was called No Quarter, you're doing a similar thing, I think, in that project, in this one, except different context. So for you, whether it's the family album or the archival selection of photographs, let's say, to you, they hold a particular version of the truth, and behind it or in between, there's the silenced kind of elements that are erased in the process, but not completely gone. And it's still possible to trace them, to find them back, let's say.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? And kind of like, what do you do exactly with the silenced parts, the things that fall between the cracks?
Yeah, I think I have different approaches for the two projects. I think the difference between the two is the representation, who is representing, right? The first, with the family album is more of a self-representation. And silence in self-representation is more closer to what Yen was speaking about before. It has a lot to do with survival. It has a lot to do with being accepted in society and so on and so forth. I think very much in line with what Yen was speaking about. And I was recreating those moments that were left undocumented by speaking to her. And she was really, really excited to speak to me, because it was her first opportunity to really let go and speak about everything that happened. And then we recreated those images through acting and photographic fiction. With this, now the project I'm working on, the work on the colonial archives, I'm also trying to have different approaches. Maybe I can speak about one particular approach that you also witnessed, thankfully, in Rotterdam.
Yeah.
So I took an image of famine that happened. That was a man-made famine. in close to the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
And that famine was then photographed by a British photographer. His name was Hooper. And he would go to these refugee camps, relief camps, basically, for famine relief, and make the people who are starving bones, skin and bones, basically, waiting for food or some sort of help. He would arrange them in front of the camera and take group portraits of them. And I found such a portrait, and I was thinking how I can sort of reveal the layers that are hidden in this photograph, right? So again, like to give to see how the silencing can be challenged.
Yeah.
So I take that photograph and I make 4 different versions of it. One is completely blank, so completely silent. One which is only a tracing of the outlines.
Mm-hmm.
One that has no people in it, only the structure that they're sitting in front of. And the final version was abstractions of their bodies, so zoomed in abstractions, so really, really focused photographs. And then these photographs were distributed through a play by an actor who was playing the role of someone who was also in that photograph.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a lot of research in folklores, in music, in stories that were passed on from generations to generations. And I've also done research in British journals that were against the imperial system at that time. A lot of journalists and British people were supportive of the colonized. And those journals are also not easily found, but there's a lot to be found there as well. So I sort of gathered all these different documentations, local stories, songs, music, folklores, and turned it into a script, basically, which the character Avita, she speaks those stories about her journey from her home to that place of the photograph. And in the process, the audience members are also made part of the play. So they're asked to play her mother, the person who sells her, the person who is photographing them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the end, after the play is done, we reveal the original photograph. So
Exactly.
that's one of the ways I'm working with.
Yeah. So this is an interesting. So here, but correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like there's different ways in which you are using silence. You're both clearly using and working with silence in your work. But what I hear from the way you describe this kind of performance piece surrounding photographs in several stages of silence, let's say, and invisibility and invisibility. I think it's therapeutic. The way you work with the audiences in your work is also therapeutic, but I think yours is more like confrontation therapy, where the audience members are also kind of asked to become, for example, the colonizer, or to step into the shoes of the photographer who is framing this and controlling the narrative. Let's say. So my question, and then I'll get back to you as well with the same question, is how do audiences respond? What kind of responses have you received from this performance, for example?
Really interesting, and a whole range of responses, actually. I think a lot of critical responses, and it also depends on where I'm showing it, right? So
Right.
if I'm the 2 times I've shown it, it's very different audiences. I think the response sometimes is that, well, you have really, really hurt me, or that now I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do. I feel a little bit abandoned. I think that really stuck with me
Abandoned.
as an audience member, because now I don't know what to do with this image. And I think we spoke about this informally as well many times. But there were also very positive remarks, people who were touched by the story, and I think it was a new information for them, and the mode of looking at photographs really changed their perception towards photography itself. So it's really been quite varying in how they responded. I remember one of the starkest moments was that the person who was asked to be the photographer just refused. That I'm not going to do it, and that is really important for me. Like the process of taking permission and giving agency to the audience to do what they want to do,
including not playing along and not fulfilling the roles that
exactly they're asked to play.
Yeah, so that is another interesting dimension of silence. Here, silence is kind of embodied action, let's say. Instead of talking, to embody and become particular persons or with particular functions in history, for example. There's not a lot of talking necessary for this person to step into the shoes of the photographer. Yet they refused because and you didn't need language for it. It was very uncomfortable for this person to become the colonizer. And she didn't do it, which it changed something about the interaction, of course, and the entire audience as well. So I was there to witness it. It was a very inspiring way of working with photographs. It brings it alive, let's say, and it forces / invites audience members to step into the photograph and into the full world kind of context of how that goes, and the power dynamics at play.
Thank you.
Back to you, in your case, also, like I said, therapeutic way of working with silence, and as well as working with photographs in the photo album. Kind of, in your case, the photo albums, I think, are catalysts or ways to get people to start remembering actively and talking to each other.
Yeah.
And then you said they were also making art. Can you say a little bit more about that? What kind of art, what are they making in these sessions?
I think the photograph is more often used as a photo elicitation. So they bring in the photos, but also as evidence of some existence. So then they come, and what I ask them is, like, remember a craft that you learned from your mother, your grandmother. And the women are often in the family. They have so many roles. They are the caretaker. They also have the homemaker, and some nowadays also a worker in the society, right? Because the inflation, like economy state, and they were often so busy. And I have so many participants come and they say, "Yeah, I don't remember my mom or my grandmother was doing art." Or they were doing art, and for very little money, they paint the sculptures, and it's like 25 cents per one, right? And then I will ask them, like, if can you use their craft to make an art? Why their craft is an art form? Why can't we just make an art of it? But not just in a way that randomly, but use them, like, for example, what do you perceive them? How do they take care of you and all this past experience, but also more like a evocation, provoked of the past bodily memory to in the making process. And then at the end, it doesn't matter what it looked like at the end. It's not about visual skills or whatever. The process is kind of a narrative therapy, as you say, that we talk about the past. And then we remind ourselves the past, but taking another angle, not just thinking about like bad things, but possible to think about the good things of our foremothers or mothers.
Yeah, and indeed, it's a way to get people to talk to each other and perhaps remember more actively and also with more pride than is usually the case for these kinds of memories that often, of course, stay in the private sphere or remain unspoken. Yeah. But then, as you said, there's also an embodied kind of element to it, similar to you, where you're also inviting people to become kind of like the foremothers that they are thinking about, to kind of realize this is the work that they did, you know, and to kind of take pride in it and realize it's not just caretaking work, for example. First of all, it is actually caretaking work, and we have to respect it for what it is. Yeah. But also, it's artful, and there's actually, we're creating beauty at the same time. Yeah, yeah. And also, at the end, this is also an empowering process for them. I don't want to take over this woman's narrative. I think it has been
is doing so for a long time in the history. That we spoke for people who actually experience it,
Yeah.
and I think what I want is to create a platform, a method for people who actually have the experience of their experience to speak for this, to speak for them, instead of to say, okay, I'm the researcher, I have so much right
Exactly.
to take over your personal narrative or life narrative.
Yeah.
I don't think it's appropriate for me. So
Yeah.
that's why I developed this method for them to speak for themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And there's also the ethical question, of course, always with this type of research where you want to get people to talk because the interpretation is silence is bad, and I, the researcher, can help you find a voice. But the ethical kind of, risk is there always that you start speaking for others or force voices out of them that they weren't comfortable in actually sharing.
Yeah.
So how do you walk that line? How do you make sure that what people share is what they want to share? That it's their story and not yours, or the way that you want to frame it.
I would say I share with them with my research, like from academic books or like the research done in Indonesia, Suriname, and Malaysia, whatever, like American, for example. And also my personal experience of listening to women in my neighborhood, in my region, because they were the one who keep outsourcing it to globally. And there was a famous term called Thai bride. That means they often just marry immigrant men, and they even have a market for it. Women just stand there and then let the men come back and choose,
Wow.
So I share what I found, and then the participant choose what they want to tell, right, about their foremothers or themselves. So if they don't want to share it, that's fine. Even though maybe I know them personally, I know there's a more fantastic story behind it, but it's really not up to me to choose. Whatever they tell me, I would take it. Like that's what they're comfortable of sharing it, and there's a lot of compromise to provide in there also. Like you want a so-called amazing research or something that they are willing to give.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's also about the scale of expectations, let's say. And
Yep.
do you have an outside audience at all? Is there an outside audience invited at some point, or do you plan to have this at some stage of this ongoing research project where an audience can see this?
I think what I have planned is at the end of the 2026, I'm going to have the first exhibition in Belvedere for Holland House, Depot, which is inside Phoenix Museum. Yeah, so that's what I expected. But for now, I'm still doing the research phase. But it's still open to outside audience, whoever have Chinese female ancestor are welcome to come enjoy and then do artwork and whatever they're feeling comfortable to share. I'm all ears. But you mean like a total public will be at the end of 2026?
Yeah, so it is working towards a kind of public exhibition where also the artworks that are made are shown?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you record, just out of interest also, do you record these sessions in any way? Do you make notes?
I make 2 recordings, but I found the participants are very aware of the recorder. So the last one I did not. So I think it's often kind of like a struggle between what makes them feel comfortable and what makes me easier as a researcher, because it's very personal and private stories.
Yeah, very good. Like this, we spoke about breaking silences before. That might differ from societal context to societal context. So if you can speak to that, feel free to do so. But at least in let's say, in a Western context, it feels as if silence is often seen as necessarily bad or a form of emptiness, something that has to be broken by any chance. And of course, both of you are working with breaking silence to some extent, but you're doing it in a very nuanced way that I think society at large could learn something from. So what do you think? First question, why is silence so scary for many people? You want to go first?
Sure. I think it's sort of related to the question that you asked her last. Like, do you have a record of these conversations.
Mhm.
I think as a civilization, somehow at some point we became obsessed with memorization and to remember and to record and to make sure that everything that has ever happened can be retrieved. And I think we haven't found a way to record silences. And that's why it comes from a primal anxiety of losing something. I don't know, death probably.
Death, yeah.
Like a fear of death. I think if we find a way to, I'm half joking, but I think if we find a way to record silences or to understand how silences are also present in historical recordings or give importance to silence and see it as a carrier of knowledge as well, I think we would step away from this sort of thinking of we must destroy it every time it is present.
Yeah. And to some extent, you're doing that, of course, or trying to do it in the performance, for example, that I witnessed. We talked about it afterwards, like you choose not to give people a full explanation, or let's say you choose not to give people the space to talk through it eventually with each other. Kind of, how did you feel? How did you feel? We talked about it, and you said, yeah, because the kind of the awkward silence that follows the performance is maybe it's part of the therapeutic work that you're trying to do.
Exactly, and that's exactly why I don't give a solution at the end of the program, because the goal is to be in silence at the end. Gazing is a silent act. You don't speak when you're gazing. It's a contemplative act, and through all the performances, ultimately, what I'm trying to do is have this moment of silence together collectively as well. And indeed, what you say is true.
Yeah. And learn in that moment. Yeah.
Yes.
And depending on audience member, they may or may not be ready for it yet. Yeah. But many people are, I think. Yeah.
We have to see. We have to try to see.
You have to keep going. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm maybe not as empathetic as Yen, but I think it also speaks of our nature. We were speaking about it last night, but I approach it from a very deep sense of injustice and anger. And we've spoken about it also, like you and I, Gerlov, before, that if there's a tiny bit of me which wants the audience to feel uncomfortable or not, and I still think about that statement. So I understand what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of those conscience questions that I asked you. Like, are you a cruel man? I asked. Yeah. Back to you. Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, so yeah, let's backtrack to the original question, which was the societal question, like why do people fear silence? Yeah. Or do you feel that they do fear silence? What do you think?
I don't think so. I think like people who want to break the silence, they want to make a change. What I see is from my region, women have been taught to be silent for a long time. I really like this quote from a Chinese American writer. She wrote the Joy Love Club. And I think that line really concludes the woman's mentality or personal building or consciousness well in China. She said to desire nothing, to swallow other people's misery, and also to eat up your own bitterness. And that's quite extreme way of silencing. You're not only silencing the public, you also have to silence yourself. You whatever you have been experienced, you don't speak up. Just eat it up. And I think that was how I was brought up, and I think there are still some women are brought up like this in China. And only when we speak up, we break the silence, we can stop this kind of like internal, cannibalism sort of.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, and this eating up of self and kind of suppressing identity entirely also as a self-perpetuating mechanism. it really makes me also think, because when it comes to silence and breaking it or not breaking it, positionality becomes really important, of course. It's not just about whose silence are we talking about, but the other question is who is asking you to break the silence. If a patriarchal system is telling people from the margins, like, speak about your pain, it's a very different dynamic from what you're doing within a more private sphere, let's say, where you're saying speak to each other. First, without an audience or without a recording, speak through your hands if you have to, speaking whatever ways works best for you.
I think for my work, the most important thing is not tell the outside world what is, we are being so suppressed, or we are being so exploited, like not to cry out like a giant baby, but more like what have been lost in the past. For example, what is really means to be an autonomy from a woman, what is an agency from a woman, and how do we break through that? That is internally, that's most important for me, and what the outside world is talking about is really not matter much.
Yeah, no, exactly, and it switches responsibility also from the person who is forced / invited enthusiastically to speak. The responsibility switches a little bit to the other side, and it becomes a responsibility of listening carefully. Listening differently, listening beyond the surface level of language, listening what a person needs in that situation, in that conversation. Yeah. And in a way, you do something similar, but in a different context. Kind of the listening is a really big part, I think, of what you do. Both in your direct work with the archive, you're listening beyond the surface level of what is shown to you, but you're also listening in the performative setting, I think, to what the audience can handle, what they need right now. Maybe they need a little more than what they are ready for. Yeah. I think this is really great, and we could go on forever, but we can't go on forever logistically. So we have to move on to the final segment, which is the objects. And this part, I always ask guests to bring something that has personal value for them, that speaks to them somehow, that carries silent meaning or memories. Who wants to go first?
Do I need to hold it, or I can just talk about it?
You can talk about it from here, and later we will...
Okay, this is a project I did back in 2020. It's very related to what I did now. It's about women's self-consciousness and autonomy and agency, but the topic is more about generational trauma. And then I bought a bunch of potato, and I always been told in my childhood, like, to be silent, and time will heal everything. But when I growing up, it's not like this, to decide nothing, to eat up others' bitterness and swallow your own bitterness. It really hurt me in some way. It makes me very angry. Even I grew up, and I did a project, sort of a self-therapy to myself, to ask, like, okay, how can I emancipate myself from this past in the family setting? Then I bought the potato and then let it grow without light, without water, without anything. And then, but before that, I will hurt them, like, with needles, with this and that, like sewings and whatever. And then I put them there and see if they can heal themselves. And then that's what they end like. And I put a raisin on top, and then to force their final look and to answer that question, like, will trauma be healed by time? Yeah.
And what do you think, looking at this?
Well, like, it's an open question. For me, it's the answer of no, but some people think it still can. Because I think in our work can't answer everyone's question or needs. And I guess it's nice to have it just as it is.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a certain aesthetic beauty to it, strangely, but it is also kind of scary in a way. And of course, maybe it does answer the question, just not in words. So maybe we can translate that back into language again, but somehow the answer is there in a material sense, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I brought a family heirloom as well. So it's something that bears on me silently, I guess. This is a medal that's given to. It's the highest honor you can get in our country. So my grandfather got this medal as a journalist, but by the time he got this award. He passed away, and my father went on stage and collected the medal. And I've seen him with this medal in his silence moments, where he would just kind of look around and turn it around and look at it for a while, not really knowing what to do with it, And then he had a really wonderful career as well. He reached the peak as a journalist as well. And then he passed away, and then it somehow got passed on to me. And now in my silent moments, I look at it and turn it around and sort of think, what am I supposed to do with it? But I know there's something I have to do. And it gives me motivation sometimes, but also stress of expectation and I think family heritage in a way. So that's what I brought.
Yeah, no, that resonates well with me too. Kind of these kind of material objects that are somehow that carry memories transgenerationally. In your case of your dad and his dad, kind of, and also this political history that is somehow attached to it. It's because it's not just any object; it's a medal. It does something to you, but indeed, trying to explain exactly what it is impossible.
Yeah,
but you sketching it, I can imagine it in my head though, and I can kind of feel it in my body as well. It proves that we can communicate beyond language.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for having us. It was really, really interesting and wonderful. Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that. I thought it was really great as well. There were lots of different silences here, I think. A lot for me to unpack afterwards as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's have a drink sometime.
Yeah, looking forward.
Yeah.
To one of our dinners, maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Eleka tamata esa lupeu. Sandete kai tamata esa lupea. Sa ndete au mina. Leke mtulu mina. Kai ale arekwa. Kai alale mise. Tolone amai rulu suike. Totonai mina. Sa ndete au